You are sitting in a parlor, not a modern living room, a Victorian parlor, which is a different thing entirely. The Victorian parlor was a room with opinions about itself, a room that had been decorated with the specific, comprehensive thoroughness of people who believed that every surface that was not covered was a surface that had given up. The walls have wallpaper, elaborate, repeating botanical patterns in deep reds and greens that catch the light of the gas lamp, in ways that the wallpaper's designer spent considerable time calculating. The furniture is upholstered in velvet. There are antimacassars on the chair backs, the small decorative cloths placed to protect the upholstery from the macassar hair oil that Victorian men applied to their hair, which tells you something specific about the Victorian parlor's relationship between aesthetic and practical concerns. There is a piano, there is a whatnot, a small shelving unit displaying the various decorative objects that the household has accumulated and that require display because display is the proof that accumulation has occurred. There are plants. There is a fireplace with a mantelpiece decorated to within an inch of its structural integrity. And there is you sitting in this room in the year 1870 in the dress that you spent approximately 45 minutes getting into this morning with the assistance of another person, because the Victorian women's dress was not, in its construction, designed to be put on alone. What are you doing? The popular answer to this question, the answer that the Victorian mythology has most thoroughly embedded in the popular imagination, is nothing much. You are sitting decoratively. You are doing perhaps some needlework. You are waiting for something to happen to you, for callers to arrive, for your husband to come home, for the future to reveal itself in whatever form the domestic arrangements of the Victorian household will eventually provide. You are, in the mythology, the angel in the house, the Victorian ideal of the middle-class woman whose entire existence was organized around the domestic sphere, whose identity was defined by her relationship to her family and her home, and whose days were filled with the genteel, undemanding occupations appropriate to her elevated but circumscribed position. This answer is, in important ways, wrong, not entirely wrong. The Victorian domestic ideology was real. The parlor was real. The constraints on middle-class Victorian women's lives were real and serious, and in many cases, genuinely damaging. But the picture of the Victorian woman as a passive, idle decorative object, drifting through empty days, has systematically misrepresented what Victorian women actually did, actually thought, and actually accomplished, both within the domestic sphere and increasingly as the century progressed beyond it. Victorian women managed. They managed households of extraordinary complexity, with staffs of servants that required active supervision, with social obligations that demanded sophisticated organizational skills, with budgets that required genuine financial intelligence, with the specific, demanding, time-consuming labor of the domestic manager who ran an institution and was not given the title that running an institution warranted. Victorian women created. They wrote. A remarkable proportion of the Victorian novel was written by women, and the women who wrote them were not dashing off light entertainments in the gaps between other activities. They painted. They composed music. They conducted scientific research, often without the formal recognition that the research warranted. They corresponded, the letter writing that the Victorian period elevated to an art form, and that produced some of the most extraordinary personal documents in the English literary tradition. Victorian women organized. As the century progressed and the specific constraints of the early Victorian domestic ideology softened under the pressure of women pushing against them, Victorian women organized philanthropic societies, educational initiatives, social reform campaigns, and eventually the political campaign for the right to vote that would define the subsequent century's opening decades. And Victorian women worked, not the women at the top of the social pyramid, for whom paid work was a specific marker of social failure, but the vast majority of Victorian women who were not at the top of the social pyramid, and for whom the choice between working for wages and not eating was not a philosophical question, but a practical one. This script is about what Victorian women really did all day. All of them: the middle-class woman in the parlor, the working-class woman in the factory, the domestic servant in someone else's house, the professional woman pushing against every institutional barrier, the aristocratic woman managing the estate, the woman in the slum whose survival required the specific daily ingenuity of the person operating with no margin for error. Let's start with the most famous version, the middle-class woman, and work outward from there. Chapter 1. The morning, the specific reality of the Victorian domestic manager. It is 7 o'clock in the morning. The lady of the house is awake. She has been awake, in fact, for some time. The Victorian middle-class household's morning routine began earlier than the leisurely image of the period suggests, and the woman who ran it was typically up before the specific hour at which the social schedule officially commenced. The maid has already been working for an hour or more. The fires lit, the boots cleaned, the breakfast preparations underway in the kitchen. But the mistress's morning has its own schedule, and it begins now. The dressing is the first significant operation. The Victorian woman's dress, the corset, the petticoats, the crinoline or the bustle, depending on the decade, the bodice and the skirt, and the various accessories that the complete outfit required, was not the work of a few minutes. The corset in particular required the specific physical assistance of another person to lace properly. And the standard Victorian corset was laced to a degree of tightness that the modern person, accustomed to clothing designed for independent dressing, would find extraordinary. The corset debate is one of the Victorian period's more energetically contested historical questions. The degree to which Victorian women were physically damaged by corsetry, the extent to which the tight lacing was universal or exceptional, the specific medical consequences of the sustained compression that the tight corset imposed, has been debated by historians with the specific passion that debates about the relationship between fashion and oppression reliably generate. The middle ground of the current historical consensus is that the corset was a significant physical constraint that affected posture, breathing, and mobility in ways that the modern person finds difficult to imagine from the outside of the garment, and that the extreme tight lacing of the most constricting examples was the minority practice, while the moderate corset was the everyday garment of the Victorian middle-class woman. Dressed, the Victorian housewife descended to the breakfast room for the morning meal that was the first social occasion of the household's day. The Victorian breakfast was not a light affair. The middle-class Victorian breakfast was a substantial meal, typically including the cooked items that the morning's kitchen labor had produced, alongside the tea and the bread, and the marmalade that were the simpler components. The breakfast was the first test of the household's kitchen management, and a Victorian housewife who tolerated bad breakfasts was a Victorian housewife who had failed to properly manage her cook. After breakfast came the morning conference with the cook. This daily consultation, the specific meeting between the lady of the house and the cook in which the day's meals were planned. The marketing requirements were identified. The specific domestic intelligence of the larder's current contents was reviewed, was one of the most important management operations of the Victorian household, and its conduct required genuine knowledge of food, of cooking, of what the family could afford, of what the season made available, and of the specific calibration of the household's meals to its social position and its domestic budget. Mrs. Beeton, the Victorian domestic goddess, the author of the Book of Household Management, first published in 1861, the woman whose book became the defining statement of middle-class domestic management, described the mistress of the household as resembling the commander of an army who must know something of the tactics of war. This is not hyperbole. The Victorian middle-class household was a complex institution that required genuine management skill, and the woman who ran it was performing a role of genuine organizational complexity. The household that the Victorian middle-class wife managed might include anywhere from 2 to 6 or more servants, depending on the family's income and social position. The general servant, the maid of all work, who performed the full range of domestic labor in the smaller household, was the single servant of the lower middle-class family, doing everything from the cooking to the cleaning to the answering of the door. The larger household had the cook and the housemaid, and the parlor maid, and possibly the nursemaid, and the lady's maid and the footman. The specialized servants, whose roles divided the household labor into the specific departments that the larger establishment required. Managing these servants was the specific daily work of the Victorian housewife that this passive sitting in the parlor image entirely misses. The Victorian servant management literature, Mrs. Beeton's included, was extensive and detailed because it needed to be. The management of servants required the specific skills of the personnel manager, including the hiring, the training, the supervision, the discipline, the payment, and the replacement of the staff that kept the household running. The servant who was incompetent or unreliable or dishonest or simply unhappy and looking for a new position. All of these required the specific management response that the Victorian housewife was responsible for providing. The morning housekeeping inspection, the walk through the household's rooms that the conscientious Victorian housewife conducted to check that the morning's cleaning had been done correctly and to identify any maintenance or supply needs that required attention, was the specific supervisory function that the household management required. The bedroom that hadn't been properly aired, the drawing room carpet whose pattern of footmarks indicated that it hadn't been adequately swept, the silver that had lost its polish since the last week's cleaning. These were the specific management problems that the inspection identified and that the subsequent conversation with the relevant servant addressed. The household accounts were the other major morning occupation of the Victorian domestic manager, and their management required genuine financial competence. The Victorian middle-class household's budget, the specific allocation of the household income between the food costs and the servant costs, and the coal and the gas and the clothing, and the social obligations, and the various other expenditures that the household required, was the financial planning that the housewife was responsible for, and the management of the accounts that tracked this budget against the actual expenditure was the specific financial administration. That fell to her. Mrs. Beeton's specific advice about account management, the daily recording of the household's expenditure, the weekly and monthly review of the accounts against the budget, the specific attention to the areas where the expenditure was exceeding the budget allocation, was advice aimed at the woman who was responsible for this management and who needed the specific guidance that the financial administration required. The Victorian housewife, who kept accurate household accounts and managed the budget within the available income, was doing the specific work of the financial administrator. And the Victorian housewife, who failed to do this, who allowed the household expenditure to exceed the income, who failed to track the accounts, who didn't know where the money was going, was failing at one of her primary professional responsibilities. The marketing, the specific task of purchasing the household's supplies, was another morning occupation performed, either by the mistress herself in the smaller or less prosperous household, or by the cook with specific instructions and a carefully managed budget in the larger establishment. The Victorian middle-class housewife, who did her own marketing, was performing the specific role of the procurement manager, negotiating with the butcher and the fishmonger and the greengrocer and the various other suppliers on whom the household depended, maintaining the specific knowledge of current prices that allowed her to identify when she was being overcharged, and building the commercial relationships with the tradespeople that the household's regular custom made possible. Chapter 2. The afternoon. Calls, cards, and the elaborate social management of Victorian women. The morning is over. It is now the afternoon. If the morning's work has been the domestic management, the servants, the accounts, the marketing, the housekeeping inspection, the afternoon belongs to a different kind of labor, one that the Victorian culture was even less likely to recognize as labor at all. The afternoon was the social time, the time of calls and callers, of visiting and being visited, of the elaborate social performance that the Victorian middle-class domestic culture required of its women, and that was as demanding in its way as the domestic management of the morning. The calling system of the Victorian period was an institution of extraordinary complexity, a finely calibrated social mechanism for managing the relationships within the middle-class social world, with specific rules about who could call on whom, how long a call should last, what topics of conversation were appropriate, how the calling card was to be deployed, and what the various ways of leaving the card communicated about the caller's intentions and their assessment of the relationship. The calling card itself, the small printed card bearing the caller's name, was the Victorian social currency that the calling system ran on, and its management was as specific as the management of any other currency. The card could be left when the called upon was not at home, communicating the fact of the visit without requiring the social interaction. A corner bent in a specific way communicated a specific message about the nature of the visit. The number of cards left, one for the mistress, two for a household couple, was the specific social code that the Victorian calling etiquette had developed for the precise management of the social relationship. The at-home hours, the specific afternoon hours during which the Victorian middle-class woman received callers, were the specific social institution that gave structure to the afternoon. The woman who was at home on Tuesday afternoons between 3 and 5 o'clock was the woman who had designated that time for the reception of visitors, and the callers who came during those hours could expect to be received. The calls that were paid during the at-home were the formal social visits of the middle-class social world, and their conduct followed the specific rules of the Victorian social etiquette that Mrs. Isabella Beeton and the various etiquette guides of the period specified in the same detailed, prescriptive way that they specified the conduct of the domestic management. The call lasted approximately 15 to 20 minutes, not less, because the very short call communicated the specific message of the reluctant visit, and not more, because the extended call imposed on the hostess beyond the bounds that the social convention prescribed. The topics of conversation appropriate to the formal afternoon call were the topics of the neutral, pleasant, uncontroversial kind: the weather, the recent social events, the health of the family, the various domestic and charitable activities that formed the common ground of the middle-class women's social world, the deeply personal, the politically controversial, the topics that might cause discomfort. These were the topics that the formal afternoon call avoided. The management of the calling system required the specific organizational skill of the social administrator. The keeping of the calling book, the record of who had called and when, who had been called upon and when the return call was due, was the specific administrative task that the Victorian housewife performed as the manager of the household's social obligations. The call that was not returned within the prescribed time communicated the specific social message of the deliberate snub, and the failure to manage the calling obligations could have consequences for the household's social position in the specific world of the middle-class neighborhood. But the afternoon was not only the formal calling, it was also the specific time for the various other social activities that the Victorian middle-class woman's life organized. The charitable visit, the call on the poor of the parish, that the Victorian domestic ideology prescribed as the specific duty of the woman of leisure, was an afternoon activity that combined the social and the moral in the specific way that the Victorian period found most appropriate. The middle-class woman who visited the poor in her parish was performing both the social obligation of the charitable Christian and the domestic management function of the household that contributed to the parish's welfare institutions. The charity work of Victorian women, the hospital visiting, the school board work, the ragged school movement, the mothers' meetings, the district visiting, the various organized philanthropic activities that the Victorian middle-class woman's organizational energy was channeled into, was a significant and underappreciated dimension of the Victorian social life. The charity was not merely the individual gesture of the charitable impulse. It was the organized, institutional, systematically managed collective activity of women who had the organizational skills and the time and the specific social access to the poor communities that made them effective agents of the Victorian social improvement movement. The Ladies' Committee, the specific institution that the Victorian charitable movement produced, the Committee of Middle-Class Women who managed the affairs of the charitable institution, was the specific organizational form in which Victorian women exercised genuine institutional power in the period before they had the formal political power to do so in other arenas. The committee chairwoman, the committee secretary, the committee treasurer. These were roles that required genuine management skill, genuine financial competence, genuine organizational intelligence, and that the Victorian women who filled them exercised with the same professionalism that their husbands exercised in the boardroom, without the title or the salary that the boardroom provided. The afternoon tea, the specifically Victorian institution, attributed in the popular tradition to Anna, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, who is said to have introduced the custom of the afternoon snack to address the sinking feeling she experienced in the long gap between the early Victorian breakfast and the late Victorian dinner, was also an afternoon social occasion with its own specific ritual and its own specific social function. The afternoon tea was the more informal version of the social visit, the gathering of women friends in the domestic space of the tea table, with its specific ceremony of the tea making and the passing of the cups, and the selection from the plates of sandwiches and cakes that the kitchen had prepared. The afternoon tea was the space where the more genuine, less formal conversation of the Victorian women's social world happened. The conversation that the formal calls constraints didn't permit. The discussion of the books that had been read and the ideas that had been encountered and the domestic challenges that were being navigated and the social events that had produced their specific consequences. The Victorian women's tea table was the specific social institution in which the intellectual and emotional life of the domestic woman was shared with the specific intimacy that the women's social world allowed, and the dismissal of the afternoon tea as a trivial social occasion has systematically undervalued the specific social function it performed. Chapter 3. the work they weren't supposed to need. Victorian women and paid employment. Let's step outside the parlor, not permanently. We'll be back. But the middle-class woman in the parlor was the specific Victorian feminine ideal. And the ideal was constructed precisely because the reality was different, and the difference was uncomfortable. The reality was that the majority of Victorian women were not middle-class women in parlors. The reality was that the majority of Victorian women worked for wages in the specific, unglamorous, economically necessary way of people who didn't have the luxury of the ideal. The census data of the Victorian period is unambiguous. In 1851, approximately 1/3 of women in England and Wales were in paid employment. By 1901, the proportion had shifted but remained substantial. These were not women working for personal fulfillment or professional ambition, though some were. They were women working because the economic arithmetic of their households required their income. The largest category of female employment in Victorian England was domestic service. The Victorian domestic servant, the woman who cleaned and cooked and washed and waited in someone else's house, was the backbone of the Victorian domestic economy, and the number of women in domestic service was genuinely enormous. In 1901, approximately 1.7 million women in England and Wales were employed as domestic servants, making domestic service the single largest category of female employment. The life of the Victorian domestic servant was a life of specific comprehensive labor that the service mythology, the cozy image of the cheerful kitchen maid and the dignified butler, has softened beyond recognition. The Victorian kitchen maid, who rose at 6 in the morning to light the kitchen fire, and who went to bed at 10 or 11 at night after the last of the day's washing up, was a person who had worked for 16 or 17 hours in conditions that the modern employment law would classify as exploitation, and that the Victorian economy classified as normal. The specific labor of the domestic servant, the coal carrying and the fire lighting, the water carrying in the houses without running water, the laundry that was the weekly ordeal of soaking and boiling and wringing and drying and ironing, the cleaning that required the specific physical labor of scrubbing floors on hands and knees, polishing grates, blackleading stoves, beating carpets, was genuinely heavy physical work, performed in the conditions that the Victorian house's lack of modern labor-saving devices required. The scullery maid, the lowest-ranked member of the larger household's kitchen staff, the young woman who washed the dishes, and the pots and the pans, and the kitchen floors in the specific conditions of the Victorian scullery, was performing labor that left her hands chronically chapped and red from the hot water and the soda that the cleaning required. The Victorian parlor maid, who carried the coal scuttles up 4 flights of stairs to the bedrooms on the top floors of the Victorian terraced house, was performing physical labor that the coal's weight and the stairs number made genuinely demanding. The domestic servant lived in the household that employed her, which meant she was available to the household's requirements 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the specific time off that her employer permitted, typically 1 afternoon per week and 1 Sunday per month. The specific allowance of the Victorian servants limited personal time. The domestic servant's bedroom was the attic room or the basement room, the least desirable space in the house, the room that was coldest in winter and hottest in summer in the specific social geography of the Victorian house that put the servants as far as possible from the family's living spaces. The textile industries were the other major category of Victorian female employment. The cotton mills of Lancashire, the woolen mills of Yorkshire, the silk mills of Macclesfield and Coventry, and the various other textile manufacturing operations that the Industrial Revolution had assembled in the specific factory towns of the North and Midlands of England. The Victorian mill girl, the young woman who operated the spinning frames and the weaving looms in the specific conditions of the Victorian textile factory, was a figure whose experience was the specific opposite of the domestic parlor's relative comfort. The textile factory's conditions were the conditions that the Victorian factory reform movement spent the first half of the century campaigning to improve, and the second half of the century implementing the specific reforms that the various factory acts prescribed. The working hours before the reforms were the working hours that the factory owner found most economically advantageous: 12, 13, 14 hours per day, 6 days a week. The working environment was the environment that the textile manufacturing process produced. The heat of the mills, the dust of the cotton fibers that the workers breathed continuously, and that produced the specific lung conditions that the occupational health literature of the period documented under the name bisonosis, the brown lung disease of the cotton worker. The women and children who worked in the textile mills were working in conditions that the Factory Act's reformers found genuinely shocking, and the parliamentary debates over the factory legislation of the 1830s and 1840s produced the specific testimony of the mill workers. The interviews with the women who had been working since childhood in the mills, whose bodies showed the specific physical consequences of the labor, whose health had been affected by the specific occupational hazards of the factory environment, that the reformers deployed as the evidence for the legislation that the factory owners resisted. The match girls of the Bryant and May factory in Bow, the young women who dipped the wooden splints in the phosphorus that made the Victorian match, were working in the specific conditions that the phosphorus created. The phossy jaw, the necrosis of the jawbone that the chronic exposure to white phosphorus produced, was the specific occupational disease of the match trade that the Bryant and May workers suffered, and that the 1888 Match Girls' strike, the specific labor action that Annie Besant organized and the match workers conducted, refusing to work until the conditions were improved, and the specific workers who had been dismissed for cooperating with Besant were reinstated, brought to public attention. The 1888 Match Girls' strike was the specific labor action that the historians of the Victorian labor movement identify as the catalyst for the new unionism. The extension of the trade union movement beyond the skilled male workers, who had been its primary constituency, to include the unskilled and semi-skilled workers, many of them women, who had been excluded from the established union movement's protection. The match girls who walked out of the Bryant and May factory in July 1888 were women who had decided that the conditions they were working in were not acceptable, and who were prepared to take the specific risk of the labor action to make that point. Chapter 4. The governess and the teacher, the specifically respectable profession of the educated Victorian woman. The governess occupied a specific, uncomfortable social position in the Victorian household. She was not a servant, or at least she was not supposed to be. Her education, her background, the specific class origins that had produced the gentlewoman who had fallen on hard economic times and was now required to earn her living. These placed her above the servants whose ranks she had nominally joined. She ate with the family or ate alone, depending on the specific household's custom. She was not invited to the social entertainments that the family attended because she was employed. She was not welcome in the servants' hall because she was not a servant. The governess was the specific figure of the educated Victorian woman who needed to earn a living, but for whom the class constraints of the Victorian social world made most forms of employment impossible. The governess's respectable poverty, the genteel limitation of the woman who came from a class background that made shop work or factory work impossible, but who lacked the income to support the lifestyle that her background implied, was the specific Victorian female predicament that the governess embodied. The governess was responsible for the education of the household's children, the daughters primarily, but often the younger sons before they went to school. The specific subjects she taught were the subjects of the genteel female education: French, music, drawing, needlework, and the rudiments of the academic subjects that the Victorian female education included. The governess's own education was the education that she was transmitting, the accomplishments of the middle-class young woman that the Victorian educational ideal prescribed. The working conditions of the governess were the working conditions of the person who was neither properly employer nor properly employee, whose status was ambiguous in every direction. The hours were long, the salary was modest, and the specific social isolation of the governess's position in the household, neither family nor servant, belonging fully to neither world, was the specific psychological challenge that the Victorian literature about the governess consistently documents. Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's 1847 novel, is the Victorian cultural document that most comprehensively explored the governess's specific situation, and Bronte was writing from the specific personal experience of the woman who had been a governess and who found the experience, as she described it in her letters, genuinely unpleasant. The governess's social isolation, the specific difficulty of the position in the household, the degradation of the educated woman required to earn her living in the service of another family. These were the specific experiences that Bronte's novel transformed into the most famous governess narrative in the English language. But the teaching profession, the school teaching that the Victorian period's expanding elementary education system was creating in genuinely large numbers, was the specific employment that the educated Victorian woman was entering with increasing frequency as the century progressed. The school boards that the Elementary Education Act of 1870 established created the specific demand for teachers, for the trained, educated women who could teach the children of the working class in the new board schools, that the teaching colleges and the pupil-teacher system were beginning to supply. The Victorian school teacher, the woman who taught in the elementary school, trained through the pupil-teacher system and sometimes through the teacher training college, managing a class of 40 or 50 children in the specific conditions of the Victorian board school, was performing professional work that required genuine skill, genuine knowledge, and genuine organizational capacity. The Victorian classroom's specific challenge, the large number of children, the wide age range, the varied abilities, the specific discipline requirements of the Victorian school culture, was the management challenge that the Victorian school teacher addressed daily. The teaching professions was the specific professional option that the educated Victorian woman could enter without the social stigma that other forms of employment carried. Teaching was respectable in the specific Victorian way of being connected to the existing female role of the educator, the governess, the mother who educated her children, while providing the institutional framework and the modest salary that the professional employment required. The teacher was the specific Victorian woman who had found the specific acceptable form of the professional life. Chapter 5. The Writers, Victorian Women, and the Literary Life. The Victorian novel was largely written by women, This is not the impression that the traditional literary canon creates. The figures who dominate the Victorian literary syllabus are Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray, and Thomas Hardy and George Eliot, and only the last of these is a woman. And George Eliot is a pseudonym that Mary Ann Evans adopted specifically to avoid the literary marketplace's specific assumptions about women's writing. The literary history that the canon creates is the literary history of the men. The literary history that the marketplace created was different. The Victorian publishing market was flooded with novels written by women, the sensation novels and the domestic novels, and the 3-volume novels that the circulating library system distributed to the Victorian reading public. And the women who wrote them were writers of genuine professional skill, whose work sold in numbers that made them commercially significant, and whose reception by the reading public was enthusiastic in ways that the subsequent critical dismissal of their work has systematically undervalued. Mary Elizabeth Braddon, the author of Lady Audley's Secret, published in 1862, the specific sensation novel whose combination of bigamy, attempted murder, madness, and domestic respectability made it the best-selling novel of its year, was a professional writer of extraordinary productivity who produced 80 novels over the course of her career. She was not an amateur writer filling her leisure hours. She was a professional author whose income from her writing supported her household, and whose relationship with her publisher was the commercial relationship of two professionals conducting business. The specific conditions under which Victorian women wrote were the conditions that the domestic ideology imposed, and that the women found the specific strategies for navigating. The famous image of Jane Austen hiding her manuscript under the blotter when visitors arrived. The writer who concealed her writing from the family visitors who would have found the writing itself unremarkable, but who would have found the ambition of the publication requiring justification, was the specific accommodation that the Victorian woman writer made to the domestic expectations of her world. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, began their literary careers by publishing under the pseudonyms Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell, the specific gender-neutral names that protected them from the specific literary marketplace's assumption that women's writing was less serious than men's. The discovery that the Bells were women produced the specific critical reassessment that the Victorian literary marketplace applied when it discovered the female authorship behind work it had previously assessed on its merits. The reassessment that found the same work somewhat less serious, somewhat more explicable by the woman's limited experience, somewhat less worthy of the critical attention it had received when the author was assumed to be male. George Eliot, Mary Ann Evans, was perhaps the most radical case of the woman writer's specific negotiation with the Victorian literary marketplace's gender assumptions. Evans adopted the male pseudonym not merely to avoid the assumption that women's writing was trivial. She had already demonstrated through her critical journalism that she was a serious intellectual who could be taken seriously on her own terms. She adopted the pseudonym partly because she was living outside the bounds of Victorian respectability in an unmarried relationship with George Henry Lewis, and the pseudonym provided the specific distance from the biographical scrutiny that the Victorian literary culture applied to the woman writer's personal life with an enthusiasm it didn't apply to the man's. The specific quality of George Eliot's novels, the philosophical depth of Middlemarch, the historical research of Romola, the psychological complexity of the character studies that her fiction produced, was the quality of the woman who had read more widely, thought more rigorously, and engaged more seriously with the intellectual questions of her time than the Victorian cultural assumption about women's intellectual capacity was designed to accommodate. Middlemarch, published in 1871 to 72, which the 20th century would eventually identify as one of the greatest novels in the English language, was the product of decades of intellectual work by a woman whose specific situation, the outsider, the woman living outside conventional respectability, the writer who had adopted the male name to be taken seriously, gave her the specific vantage point from which the provincial English life she described could be seen with the clarity that the novel's characterization demonstrates. The women who wrote, and they wrote in genuinely large numbers, were writing in the time that the domestic schedule permitted in the specific corners of the day, that the management of the household and the social obligations and the care of children left available. The Victorian woman writer was frequently the woman who wrote at the kitchen table while the children were occupied, who wrote in the early morning before the household's activities began, who wrote late at night after the household was settled, who managed the writing around and through the domestic obligations rather than in place of them. Chapter 6. The Scientific Women. How Victorian women did science and were thanked with invisibility. The data was collected by women. Not all of it, not in every laboratory and every field station and every observatory, but a significant, specific, and systematically undercredited proportion of the Victorian scientific enterprise. The observations recorded, the specimens collected, the calculations performed, the illustrations produced, the data organized, was the work of women who did not appear on the title pages of the papers that the work supported, and who did not receive the fellowship of the learned society that the work would have earned a man of equivalent contribution. The Victorian scientific world had a specific relationship with women that can be described, without significant exaggeration, as the relationship of the institution that was happy to use women's labor and unhappy to acknowledge women's capability. The Royal Society did not admit women as fellows until 1945. The Geological Society of London admitted women from 1919. The various other learned societies that constituted the institutional structure of the Victorian scientific world each maintained their own specific timeline for the acknowledgement that the women who were doing science were scientists, a timeline that, in every case, ran considerably behind the timeline of the women's actual contribution to the scientific work. Mary Anning, who is not, strictly speaking, a Victorian, dying in 1847 at the beginning of the period, is the specific case that the fossil hunting tradition established as the paradigm of the woman whose scientific contribution was used without being properly credited. Anning discovered the first complete ichthyosaur skeleton, discovered the first plesiosaur skeleton, and made the specific contributions to the understanding of the Jurassic marine world that the geologists and the paleontologists of the period built their theories on. The tongue twister, she sells seashells by the seashore, was about Anning. The scientific credit for the discoveries was not. The tongue twister remembered her. The Geological Society, which she supplied with specimens and whose members published papers based on her discoveries, did not admit her to membership. Mary Somerville, the Scottish mathematician and scientist whose 1834 work on the connection of the physical sciences was the specific synthesis of the period's scientific knowledge that the Victorian educated public read, and that John Couch Adams cited as the specific inspiration for his prediction of the existence of Neptune, was the woman who gave the English language the word scientist. The word was coined by William Whewell in an 1834 review of Somerville's book, specifically to describe her, because the existing words, philosopher, man of science, were gendered in ways that Somerville's existence made inadequate. She gave the language the word for the occupation that the occupation's institutions then declined to permit her to join. The Royal Society hung her portrait in its rooms. It did not make her a fellow. The botanical illustration was the specific scientific contribution of Victorian women that the institutional structure most thoroughly exploited and most consistently declined to credit adequately. The illustration of the natural history specimen, the specific, precise, scientifically accurate rendering of the plant or the animal, or the fossil in the form that the scientific publication required, was work that required genuine scientific knowledge, genuine artistic skill, and the specific patience of the illustrator, who could spend weeks on a single plate. It was also work that the scientific publishing tradition treated as the technical support for the science, rather than the science itself, and the women who produced it were the technical support staff, whose contribution the title page did not require to acknowledge. Marianne North, the Victorian botanical artist, who spent 17 years traveling to remote parts of the world to paint the plants in their natural habitats, who produced 832 paintings of the world's flora, who funded the building of the Marianne North Gallery at Kew Gardens out of her own resources and donated the entire collection to the Royal Botanic Gardens, is the Victorian scientific woman whose contribution was so specific and so large that it could not be entirely overlooked. The gallery that bears her name is still at Kew. The paintings are still there, but North was the exception in having the resources and the specific stubbornness to ensure that her contribution was acknowledged. The majority of the Victorian women who contributed to the scientific enterprise were not in a position to fund their own gallery or to resist the institutional tendency to absorb their work into the credit of the men who oversaw the institution. The computers were women. The specific word computer, before it named the machine, named the person who performed the calculations, and the Victorian observatories and the Victorian scientific institutions employed women computers in significant numbers because the calculations required were extensive, because the work was painstaking and required accuracy rather than the theoretical novelty that the institution reserved for the men, and because women could be paid less than men to perform the same work. The Harvard computers, the women employed by the Harvard College Observatory from 1875 onward to perform the astronomical calculations and the stellar classification work that the observatory's research required, were the specific institution of the women computers that the American astronomical tradition produced, but the British observatories maintained equivalent arrangements. The work that the computers produced, the stellar catalogs, the variable star records, the spectral classifications that formed the foundation of the understanding of stellar physics, was science. The women who produced it were scientists. The institutional recognition that they received for this work was the recognition of the employee rather than the recognition of the scientist. Williamina Fleming, who was employed as a Harvard computer and who developed the spectral classification system that became the foundation of stellar classification, discovered the Horsehead Nebula and cataloged approximately 10,000 stars. She was eventually given the title of Curator of Astronomical Photographs, a title that acknowledged her work without granting her the academic standing that the equivalent male contribution would have produced. The botanical work was another domain where Victorian women made contributions that the institutional structure consistently absorbed into the credit of the male botanists they worked with or for. The herbarium collections that the Victorian botanical tradition assembled, the specific, organized, labeled collections of pressed plant specimens that the botanical knowledge required, were assembled and maintained and extended by women workers whose specific contribution to the collection the published catalog did not always acknowledge with the specificity that the contribution warranted. The exception that illuminates the rule was Beatrix Potter, the woman who is now remembered for Peter Rabbit, and who is not remembered because the institutional rejection ensured that the work was not published and therefore not available to be remembered for the specific mycological research she conducted on the germination of spores and the symbiotic relationships of fungi and algae that her careful microscopy produced. Potter's paper on the germination of spores was presented to the Linnean Society in 1897. Presented by a man because women could not present papers to the Linnean Society, and was received with the specific mixture of the acknowledgement that the research was interesting and the skepticism that the source of the research invited. Potter was advised to continue her research. She continued it. The Linnean Society did not publish her conclusions. She went on to write Peter Rabbit. The mycological research was not rediscovered and properly credited until the 1990s. The Victorian scientific woman's specific experience was the experience of doing the work, having the work used, and watching the credit travel in the specific direction of the institution that had used it. This was not the universal experience. There were Victorian women who achieved genuine recognition and genuine institutional standing, and the course of the century moved imperfectly and too slowly in the direction of the greater recognition. But the pattern was specific enough and consistent enough to be described as the institutional tendency of the Victorian scientific world, and the modern revaluation of the Victorian women scientists' contributions, the restoration of the credit that the original publication had withheld, is the specific, ongoing project of the historians of science who are reconstructing what the Victorian scientific enterprise actually looked like when you count the women. Chapter 7. The Political Women. The campaigns, the organizations, and the slow, specific work of changing the law. The petition had 1,499 signatures. The specific petition of 1866, the women's suffrage petition presented to the House of Commons by John Stuart Mill and Henry Fawcett, the first petition explicitly calling for women's suffrage to be presented to the British Parliament, had 1,499 signatures collected by the specific network of women who had been organizing the campaign for women's suffrage in the years preceding the petition. The petition was presented. Parliament debated the question. Parliament declined to act. This was not the end. It was the specific beginning of the campaign that would last more than 50 years, would involve hundreds of thousands of women, would produce the specific organizations and the specific tactics and the specific political conflicts that the history of the women's suffrage movement documents, and would eventually produce the Representation of the People Act 1918 that gave women over 30 the right to vote, and the Equal Franchise Act 1928 that gave women the same voting rights as men. The political life of Victorian women, the specific, organized, institutionalized political activity that Victorian women conducted in the public sphere, despite and through the specific constraints that the Victorian political culture imposed on women's formal political participation, was not the minor background activity that the invisibility of women in the formal political record suggests. It was a major dimension of the Victorian political landscape, operating through the specific channels that the formal exclusion from the parliamentary franchise left available. The Anti-Corn Law League, the early Victorian campaign for the repeal of the Corn Laws, that was one of the first major political campaigns to systematically recruit and organize women, established the specific model of the women's political organization that the subsequent campaigns would develop. The women of the Anti-Corn Law League ran bazaars, collected signatures, distributed literature, organized meetings, and contributed the specific organizational energy that the campaign's leadership recognized as essential to its success. Richard Cobden's acknowledgement of the women's contribution, the specific, explicit recognition that the campaign could not have succeeded without the women who organized and participated in it, was the specific early Victorian acknowledgement of the political effectiveness of women's organized activity. The temperance movement was the other early Victorian political campaign that women entered in large numbers, and the specific moral authority that the Victorian domestic ideology assigned to women, the woman as the guardian of the domestic sphere, the protector of the family from the specific harm of the male's vices, gave the women's temperance work a specific public legitimacy that the women's suffrage campaign did not initially have. The woman who campaigned against alcohol was the woman protecting her family. The woman who campaigned for the vote was the woman stepping outside her proper sphere. The British Women's Temperance Association, founded in 1876, was the specific organization that channeled Victorian women's temperance work into the institutional form that the large-scale campaign required. The BWTA's membership, the tens of thousands of women who joined the organization and participated in its campaigns, was the specific mass membership that the Victorian women's political organization could achieve in the area where the domestic ideology permitted the political activity. The education campaigns were the other major arena of Victorian women's organized political activity. The specific campaigns for the admission of women to the universities, to the professional examinations, and to the educational institutions whose exclusion of women was the specific mechanism of the professional and intellectual exclusion that followed from it. Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who would become the specific leader of the Constitutional Women's Suffrage Movement and the president of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, began her political life in the education campaigns of the 1860s, working with her sister Elizabeth Garrett Anderson in the specific network of women who were challenging the educational exclusions that the Victorian institutional structure maintained. The specific connection between the education campaign and the suffrage campaign, the recognition that the political exclusion was the foundation on which the professional and educational exclusions were built, and that the vote was the specific instrument whose absence made all the other exclusions sustainable, was the specific political logic that the Victorian women's movement was developing through the experience of the specific campaigns. The Langham Place Group, the specific network of women who gathered around the English Woman's Journal. From 1858 onward, the Victoria Press that printed it, and the various organizations that the network spawned, was the specific institutional foundation of the organized Victorian women's movement. The group included Barbara Lee Smith Beaudeschon, Bessie Rayner Parks, Adelaide Ann Proctor, and the various other women whose specific combination of the feminist conviction, the organizational skill, and the social position to conduct public campaigns gave the movement its early institutional structure. The campaigns that the Langham Place Group organized and supported were the campaigns that addressed the specific legal and institutional disabilities that Victorian women faced. The Married Women's Property Act campaigns, the campaigns for women's access to higher education, the campaigns for women's admission to the medical profession, the suffrage petition. Each of these was the specific, organized, systematic campaign that required the specific management skills of the political organizer. The letter writing, the petition organizing, the meeting, arranging the press management, the parliamentary lobbying. And that produced the specific results of the Victorian feminist political movement, the Married Women's Property Acts, the 1870 and 1882 acts that gave married women the right to own property, to keep their earnings, to enter contracts in their own name, were the specific legislative achievements that the Women's Property Campaign produced after decades of organized effort. Before the 1870 Act, the legal doctrine of coverture meant that the married woman had no independent legal existence. Her property, her income, her legal identity were absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. The campaign to change this was the campaign that combined the legal argument, the political organization, and the specific personal testimony of the women who had experienced the specific harm of the coverture doctrine, and whose combination eventually produced the legislation that the Victorian Parliament passed. The suffrage campaign's development through the Victorian period was the development from the polite petition of 1866 to the organized mass movement of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. The specific institutional development of the constitutional campaign that Millicent Garrett Fawcett would lead into the Edwardian period, the Women's Social and Political Union that the Pankhursts would found in 1903, and the subsequent militancy that would make the suffrage campaign the most politically dramatic women's campaign in British history. But the Victorian suffrage campaign was the constitutional campaign, the campaign that worked through the specific mechanisms of the parliamentary petition, the public meeting, the systematic lobbying of sympathetic MPs, the gradual accumulation of the political pressure that the parliamentary system eventually responds to. The women who ran this campaign were the women doing the specific, unglamorous, essential work of the political organization, the committee meetings, the correspondence, the public speaking, the branch organizing, the fundraising, the regular production of the arguments and the evidence and the advocacy that the long campaign required. Chapter 8. The Working Class Day. What Victorian life actually looked like below the parlor. The parlor did not exist, not for the majority of Victorian women. The parlor, the specific room with the velvet furniture and the antimacassars and the whatnot, and the afternoon calling hours, was the specific domestic space of the middle-class household, and the middle-class household was the minority of the Victorian population. The majority of Victorian women lived in the specific material conditions of the working-class household, the two-room tenement, the back-to-back terrace, the shared court of the industrial city, the specific domestic environment that the industrial economy's wages produced for the people whose labor the industrial economy required. The working-class Victorian Woman's Day began earlier than the middle-class woman's and lasted longer and was organized around the specific, non-negotiable requirements of keeping the household functioning on an income that the middle-class woman's household management budget would have classified as impossible. The fire was the first thing, the specific task of the morning that everything else depended on. The Victorian working-class household's fire was the cooking fire and the heating fire and the water heating fire, the single source of the thermal energy that the household required for all its functions and the management of the fire, the lighting of it, the maintaining of it, the specific management of the coal supply that kept it going, was a specific ongoing domestic task that shaped the entire domestic day. The coal was the working-class household's specific financial anxiety. The price of coal, the specific amount the household could afford, the management of the coal supply through the winter months when the fire was essential. These were the financial calculations of the working-class domestic manager who operated with the specific constraint of the income that the coal merchants' prices regularly tested. The the woman who managed the coal supply, who bought in the quantity that the income permitted, who managed the fire at the intensity the weather required without burning the supply faster than the budget sustained, was doing the specific financial management of the household's most essential resource. The water was the next thing. The Victorian working-class household in the earlier decades of the century, before the piped water supply that the public health reforms eventually provided, was the household that got its water from the street pump or the shared standpipe in the court. The water that required the carrying of the specific weight of the buckets from the source to the house, up the stairs, if the household was above the ground floor, for all the household's water requirements. The carrying of water was physical labor, the specific, daily, unavoidable physical labor of the household that had no running water, and it was primarily the labor of women and girls. The laundry was the Victorian working-class household's weekly ordeal. Monday was washing day in the specific universal convention of the Victorian working-class domestic calendar, the day when the household's laundry was washed, and the process of washing it was the process that turned Monday into the specific, exhausting, physically demanding day that the working-class woman's domestic week organized itself around. The soaking of the clothes in the copper of boiling water, the scrubbing of the heavily soiled items on the washboard, the wringing of the wet clothes through the mangle, if the household had one, or by hand if it didn't, the hanging of the wet laundry to dry in whatever space the household had available. This was the specific physical labor of the Victorian wash day. The drying was the specific challenge of the Victorian working-class household's laundry. The specific problem of where to dry the large quantity of wet laundry in the limited space of the working-class house without access to the garden that the middle-class house provided. The clothes line strung across the court between the houses, the clothes horse set up in front of the fire, the wet laundry draped over whatever surface was available in the kitchen. These were the specific improvised solutions to the specific problem of the drying, and the specific smell of the damp laundry drying in the closed space of the Victorian working-class kitchen was the specific smell of Monday in the working-class household. The cooking was the other major domestic labor of the working-class household, and the specific challenge of the working-class cooking was the challenge of producing adequate nutrition from the specific limited ingredients that the household's income permitted, in the specific equipment that the household had available, on the specific fuel that the coal supply and the fire's management provided. The working-class woman's kitchen was not Mrs. Beaton's kitchen, the well-equipped kitchen of the middle-class household, with its range and its batterie de cuisine, and its larder, and its well-stocked store cupboard. It was the kitchen of the single pot, and the limited supply, and the specific creativity of the domestic cook, who understood the maximum use of the minimum ingredient. The bread that the working-class household baked, where it had the oven access that the bread required, was the specific daily necessity, the caloric foundation of the diet, whose production required the time and the skill that the working-class woman applied alongside all the other domestic tasks of the day. The children were present throughout. The working-class Victorian woman's domestic day was conducted in the specific company of the children who were not yet old enough to go to school, or who had returned from school, or who had not been sent to school at all. The children whose care was the simultaneous background task of all the other domestic tasks, the constant management requirement of the household with young children that made the specific isolation of any domestic task impossible. The Victorian working-class mother, who was doing the laundry, was also watching the children, and the children in the working-class household represented the specific, unsupervised physical danger of the household, where the fire and the wash copper and the unguarded windows and the street outside were the constant sources of the specific risk that the constant supervision was trying to manage. The industrial homework, the specific paid work that the Victorian working class woman brought into the house to perform alongside the domestic work, was the specific economic contribution of the household that the husband's wage alone was insufficient to maintain. The matchbox making, the trouser finishing, the fur pulling, the chain making, the specific piecework industries that the Victorian economy had developed to exploit the specific economic vulnerability of the woman who needed to earn but could not leave the house, were performed at the kitchen table, by the fire, in the stolen hours between the domestic tasks, for the specific piece rate that the industry paid. The piece rate was a specific economic exploitation of the homework system. The matchbox maker who produced a gross of matchboxes received the specific, inadequate payment that the piece rate allowed, and the number of matchboxes required to produce a living income from the piece rate was the number that made the matchbox making the specific, all-consuming occupation of the woman who spent her available hours at the kitchen table gluing and folding. The piece rate. Industries of the Victorian economy were the industries that exploited the specific economic desperation of the woman who could not negotiate better terms because the alternative, earning nothing, was worse. Chapter 9. The body. What Victorian medicine did to women in the name of their own good. The doctor knew best. The specific confidence of the Victorian medical profession in its own authority over the female body was the confidence of the institution that had recently professionalized itself. The General Medical Council was established in 1858, the specific moment at which the medical profession formally organized its credentialing and its authority. And that was applying the specific theories of the Victorian medical science to the specific bodies of the Victorian women with the specific enthusiasm of the newly credentialed expert. The theories were not always correct. The Victorian medical tradition's understanding of the female body was the understanding of the institution that had, until recently, systematically excluded women from its own membership, and that was therefore theorizing about the female body from the specific outside position of the male observer, whose knowledge was the knowledge of the dissection and the observation and the clinical encounter, rather than the knowledge of the embodied experience. The specific gap between the theory and the lived reality was the gap that the Victorian women's health reform movement was attempting to bridge throughout the century with the specific urgency of women who were being told things about their own bodies that their own experience contradicted. The nervous exhaustion was the specific Victorian diagnosis that covered the vast range of conditions: depression, anxiety, intellectual ambition, the specific dissatisfaction of the woman confined to the domestic role, that the Victorian medical tradition attributed to the specific vulnerability of the female nervous system to the demands of the intellectual life. The woman who read too much, who thought too intensely, who engaged with the public world beyond the domestic sphere. This woman was, in the Victorian medical theory, the woman who was placing inappropriate demands on the nervous system that the female constitution had been designed for the domestic role, not the intellectual one. The rest cure, the specific treatment that Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell developed in America, and that the Victorian medical tradition enthusiastically adopted, was the prescription of the complete rest, the withdrawal from all intellectual activity, the confinement to the domestic and the passive, for the woman whose nervous exhaustion required the treatment of the removal of the specific cause. The rest cure was the medical prescription of exactly the conditions that the women being treated found most damaging, and the specific testimony of the women who underwent it. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, the specific literary document of the rescuer's psychological harm that Gilman wrote from her own experience, was the specific cultural evidence that the treatment was not merely ineffective, but actively harmful. The hysteria diagnosis was the Victorian medical tradition's most comprehensive tool for the classification of the female complaint that did not fit the specific somatic categories that the physical examination could identify. The word hysteria derives from the Greek hystera, the uterus, the specific etymology that reveals the specific assumption that the female nervous and psychological complaints were rooted in the specific organ of the female reproductive system. The Victorian medical tradition maintained this assumption with considerable confidence, attributing the specific range of the hysterical symptoms, the paralysis, the seizures, the specific emotional displays, the various somatic complaints, to the specific malfunctioning of the uterus or the ovaries. The treatment of hysteria was the treatment of the reproductive organ. The specific surgical interventions that the Victorian gynecological surgery developed for the management of the hysterical woman. The ovariotomy, the surgical removal of the ovaries, was performed on women with psychiatric symptoms on the specific theory that the ovaries were the source of the symptoms and their removal would relieve them. The specific evidence that the surgery produced the intended results was the evidence of the enthusiastic surgeon rather than the controlled clinical trial. And the women who underwent ovariotomies for psychiatric symptoms were the women whose specific experience of the Victorian medical system's authority over the female body was the most invasive and the most irreversible. The chlorosis, the green sickness of the Victorian medical literature, the specific condition of the anemic, pale, listless young woman, was the diagnosis that covered the specific nutritional consequences of the Victorian middle-class diet as applied to the growing female body. The iron deficiency anemia that the Victorian diet, with its specific restrictions on the foods considered appropriate for young ladies and its specific anxiety about the appetite that suggested unfeminine coarseness, produced in the young women of the middle class, was the specific somatic consequence of the cultural restriction of the female diet. The treatment, the iron supplement, the improvement of the diet, was simple and effective when it was applied. The Victorian medical tradition's attribution of the chlorosis to the specific constitutional weakness of the female was the specific diagnostic error that delayed the effective treatment. The women who entered the Victorian medical profession, the specific small number of women who pushed through the institutional barriers to become doctors, were the women who could see from the inside what the male doctors were doing to the female patients and who had the specific professional authority to say something about it. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who obtained the medical qualification through the Society of Apothecaries after the medical schools that had initially admitted her reversed their decision, who subsequently co-founded the London School of Medicine for Women to provide the educational route that the existing institutions were blocking, was the specific figure of the Victorian woman doctor, whose existence was the institutional challenge to the theory that women were not suited to the medical profession. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to obtain a medical degree in the United States, who subsequently established the New York Infirmary for Women and Children, and who contributed the specific institutional model of the women's hospital staffed by women to the Victorian medical reform tradition, was the specific example that Garrett Anderson followed, and that the women's medical education movement cited as the proof that the institutional barriers were the problem, rather than any incapacity in the women themselves. The women who became doctors were the women who could then tell the women who came to them as patients the specific things about their bodies and their health that the male medical tradition had been unable to tell them, partly because of the specific knowledge gap of the theory that excluded the embodied experience, and partly because of the specific social constraints that made certain conversations between the male doctor and the female patient impossible in the Victorian social framework. The woman patient who could not describe her specific gynecological symptoms to the male doctor because the Victorian social code made the conversation impossible was the woman patient whose specific health need the women's medical movement was designed to address. Chapter 10. The Education. What Victorian women were taught, what they were denied, and what they built anyway. The education was designed to produce accomplishments, not knowledge, not intellectual capacity, not the specific trained ability to analyze and argue, and construct and create that the education of the boy was imperfectly and inconsistently attempting to produce. The education of the Victorian middle-class girl was designed to produce the accomplishments, the piano playing and the watercolor painting, and the French conversation and the graceful needlework, that the Victorian marriage market valued as the specific evidence of the genteel upbringing that the husband's domestic acquisition was supposed to display. The accomplishment was not knowledge of the subject. The girl who could play the piano at a social gathering had not necessarily learned to read music with the fluency that the serious musician required. The girl who could produce a watercolor of acceptable prettiness had not necessarily studied the theory of color and composition that the trained artist understood. The girl who could conduct a conversation in French had not necessarily read the French literature in its original language with the comprehension that the genuine linguist commanded. The accomplishment was the performance of the surface, the specific, socially adequate demonstration of the cultural refinement that the marriage market required, produced by the specific, limited education that the accomplishment needed, rather than the deeper education that the subject warranted. The specific comparison with the boy's education, the classical curriculum of the Victorian public school, with its Latin and its Greek, and its mathematics, and its specific training in the analytical and rhetorical skills that the Victorian professions required, was the comparison that the Victorian educational reformers made with the specific clarity of the observer who could see what the different curricula were producing. The boy who had studied Latin was the boy who had learned the specific discipline of the grammatical analysis, the specific mental habit of the careful construction of the argument, the specific cultural literacy of the classical tradition. The girl who had learned the piano accomplishment had learned the piano accomplishment. The reform of women's education was therefore the reform that required a completely different curriculum, not the superficial accomplishments of the marriage market, but the genuine intellectual formation that the boy's education was attempting to provide. The specific reformers who built the Victorian women's education movement: Frances Mary Buss, who founded the North London Collegiate School in 1850, Dorothea Beale, who became principal of the Cheltenham Ladies' College in 1858, Anne Jemima Clough, and Millicent Garrett Fawcett, who established Newnham College, Cambridge in 1871, Emily Davies, who founded Girton College, Cambridge in 1869, were the specific women who understood that the accomplishment curriculum was the specific institutional mechanism of the intellectual restriction, and who built the alternatives that the restriction made necessary. Frances Mary Buss and Dorothea Beale are the two women whose names the Victorian educational tradition has preserved in the specific, undignified form of the school rhyme. Miss Buss and Miss Beale, Cupid's darts do not feel. How different from us, Miss Beale and Miss Buss. The rhyme was the specific mockery of the two women whose educational ambition had placed them outside the domestic, feminine ideal. The women who had chosen the school over the marriage, the institution over the household, the education of other women over the production of their own family. The rhyme was the specific small cruelty of the culture that finds the woman who doesn't conform to the domestic expectation amusing. What Buss and Beale actually did was build the specific institutions that made the serious education of women possible in the Victorian period. The North London Collegiate School under Buss provided the rigorous academic curriculum, the mathematics, the science, the classical languages, the serious intellectual formation that the accomplishment school did not. The Cheltenham Ladies' College under Beale was the school that took the education of girls as seriously as the education of boys, with the specific emphasis on intellectual development rather than social accomplishment that the serious educator understood the difference between. Girton College and Newnham College were the specific institutions that the most ambitious achievement of the Victorian women's education movement produced. The Cambridge colleges, for women that gave the women who attended them the specific, rigorous academic education of the Cambridge curriculum. The women of Girton and Newnham studied the same subjects as the men of Cambridge. The mathematics tripos, the classical tripos, the moral sciences tripos, and sat the same examinations. When Philippa Fawcett, the daughter of Millicent Garrett Fawcett, placed above the senior wrangler in the mathematics tripos of 1890, finishing first in the examination that Cambridge's most demanding mathematical curriculum produced. The specific public demonstration of the women's intellectual equality that the examinations provided was a demonstration that the mathematical performance made impossible to dismiss. Cambridge did not award Philippa Fawcett the degree that her performance would have earned a man. Cambridge did not award degrees to women until 1948. The specific performance that exceeded the best male performance in the examination was acknowledged by the inset note in the results list above the senior wrangler, and not by the degree that the performance warranted. The gap between the achievement and the institutional recognition was the specific, concrete, undeniable measure of the Victorian educational system's specific injustice. The elementary education of the working class girl was a different matter, entirely from the middle class accomplishment curriculum or the Girton education. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 made elementary schooling available to all children, and the subsequent compulsory education legislation made it mandatory. The specific transformative intervention in the Victorian working class child's life that gave the working class girl the specific educational foundation that the previous generation had largely lacked. The board school education of the working class girl was the education of the basic literacy and numeracy, the reading and the writing, and the arithmetic that the Victorian educational reformers identified as the minimum that the modern citizen required. It was also the specific limited education of the institution that had decided what the working class girl needed, rather than asking what the working class girl wanted. The curriculum that included the domestic subjects of the sewing and the cooking alongside the academic subjects, because the Victorian educational system was sure that the working class girl's future was in the domestic service or the working class household management rather than in the academic or professional life that the curriculum's limitation was designed to ensure. The specific constraint of the working class girl's educational aspiration, the expectation that the elementary school was the education's end rather than its beginning, that the scholarship to the secondary school was the exceptional achievement rather than the normal progression, that the university was the specific territory that the working class girl was not expected to reach, was the educational version of the broader social constraint that the Victorian class system applied to the working class person's ambitions. The education was real. The ceiling was also real. Chapter 11. The dress what? The Victorian woman's clothing actually meant, and what it actually did. The corset was not only oppression. This is the statement that the history of Victorian women's dress requires making clearly, because the popular narrative of the Victorian corset, the oppressive garment, the instrument of the patriarchal body control, the specific physical mechanism of the restriction of women's activity and freedom, is not wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter for understanding what Victorian women actually experienced and actually thought about the clothes they wore. The Victorian corset was all of these things. A garment that reshaped the body into the silhouette that the Victorian fashion ideal required, that affected posture and breathing and mobility in ways the modern person would find constraining, that required assistance to put on and take off, and that the medical profession of the period both condemned in its extreme forms and participated in maintaining by certifying the moderate corset as medically acceptable. The corset was a genuine physical constraint, and the dress reform movement that campaigned against it from the 1880s onward was not campaigning against an imaginary harm. But the Victorian woman who wore the corset was not, in most cases, the woman who experienced it as the oppressive garment of the feminist narrative. She was the woman who experienced it as her normal clothing, the specific garment that she had been wearing since adolescence, that her body had adapted to, that gave her the posture and the silhouette and the specific physical support that her experience of the garment had taught her to find functional, and her culture had taught her to find aesthetically appropriate. The dress reform movement that sought to liberate Victorian women from the corset encountered the specific, consistent resistance of Victorian women who didn't want to be liberated from it, who found the rational dress reformers alternative as alien to their bodily experience, as the person who has worn a particular type of footwear their entire life finds the sudden switch to a different type uncomfortable. The specific gap between the reformer's vision of liberation and the reformed person's experience of the liberation is the gap that every reform movement encounters when it attempts to impose a vision of bodily freedom that the body being freed has not yet developed the experience to appreciate. The specific social function of the Victorian woman's dress was the function of the specific, precise signaling system that the Victorian class society had developed to communicate the wearer's social position, marital status, income level, age, and the specific occasion through the specific combination of the fabric, the silhouette, the trimming, and the color that the Victorian dress code prescribed for each category. The woman who wore the specific combination of the fabric and the cut and the color that her social position required was the woman who was communicating her social identity in the specific visual language of the Victorian dress code. And the woman who wore the wrong combination was the woman who had committed the specific social error of the wrong dress. The morning dress was the most elaborate and most socially specified component of the Victorian dress code. The specific prescribed sequence of the mourning costumes that the Victorian bereavement culture required the widow and the bereaved family member to wear through the specific stages of the mourning period. The full mourning of the first stage required the specific matte black fabric of the parramatta and the crepe, the specific dull black material that the mourning convention prescribed because its lack of sheen communicated the specific sincere absence of vanity that the genuine grief was supposed to produce. The second stage permitted the introduction of the less matte fabrics. The half mourning permitted the purple and the gray and the white trim. The full mourning lasted 2 years for the widow. The mourning for a parent lasted 12 months. The mourning for a sibling lasted 6 months. The specific economic consequence of the Victorian mourning dress requirement was the specific, substantial cost of the wardrobe that the bereavement imposed on the bereaved household. The mourning outfitter's shop was the specific commercial institution that the mourning dress requirement created, the business that provided the rapid supply of the appropriate mourning wardrobe on the short notice that the death's unpredictability imposed. The widow who could not afford the appropriate mourning wardrobe was the widow who was failing, visibly and publicly, to perform the grief that the Victorian social convention required, and the specific social pressure of this failure was the pressure of the culture that had made the external performance of the internal state a public obligation. The dress reform movement, the specific Victorian campaign for the rational dress that the aesthetic reformers and the physical culture advocates and the feminist campaigners variously promoted, was the campaign that challenged the Victorian dress code's most physically constraining requirements: the corset, the trailing skirt, the excessive petticoats, the specific combination of garments that the reformers argued restricted women's physical activity and damaged women's health. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, campaigned for the specific reform of the dress requirements that it identified as harmful: the restriction on the total weight of underclothing, the removal of the tight lacing, the adoption of the divided skirt or the bifurcated garment for the physical activities that the conventional skirt impeded. The divided skirt, the specific garment of the dress reform movement that permitted the active physical movement that the conventional skirt prevented, was the specific test of the reformers' proposal in the specific arena of the physical activity that the conventional dress most obviously restricted. The woman who wanted to bicycle in 1890 and the bicycle craze of the 1890s was the specific mass phenomenon of the newly available safety bicycle that women adopted with the specific enthusiasm of the person who has discovered a form of freedom. Was the woman who encountered the specific, practical problem of the conventional dress's incompatibility with the bicycle's physical requirements. The bloomers, the specific full-cut trousers gathered at the ankle that the American dress reformer Amelia Bloomer had promoted in the 1850s, and that the Victorian bicycle culture was rediscovering in the 1890s, were the specific garment of the cycling woman, whose adoption of the practical clothing that the bicycle required was the specific, visible, public statement of the woman who had decided that the physical activity was worth the social disapproval that the unconventional dress attracted, the specific mockery that the cycling woman in bloomers attracted from the specific section of the Victorian public that found the sight of a woman in trousers alarming was the specific small hostility of the culture encountering the embodied challenge to its specific assumptions about what the female body should be allowed to do. The dress was never only the dress. The Victorian woman's clothing was the specific daily performance of the social identity that the Victorian culture had assigned to her, and the specific choices within the clothing, the degree of the corset's tightness, the adoption of the rational dress, the decision to cycle in bloomers were the specific daily negotiations between the individual woman's physical comfort and practical needs and the social expectations that the clothing was supposed to express. The fashion was the politics. The corset was the argument. The bicycle bloomers were the specific, visible, practical declaration that the physical activity was more important than the conventional appearance. Chapter 12. The Marriage. What Victorian marriage actually meant, in law, in practice, and in the lives of the women. It defined the marriage was a legal transformation, not metaphorically, literally. The Victorian woman who married underwent the specific legal transformation of the coverture doctrine, the specific legal principle that the common law inherited from the medieval tradition and that the Victorian legal system maintained until the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 began to dismantle it. Under coverture, the married woman had no independent legal existence. She was, in the specific legal language of Blackstone's commentaries, civilly dead. Her legal identity merged into her husband's upon marriage, her property transferred to his ownership, her contracts requiring his agreement to be valid, her earnings belonging to him, her children legally his. The specific practical consequences of coverture were the consequences that made the Victorian wife's legal situation one of the most comprehensive legal disabilities in the English common law tradition. The wife could not own property in her own name. The wife could not enter a contract without her husband's consent. The wife's earnings, whether from the domestic labor of the household or from the paid employment that the working-class wife undertook, belonged to her husband. The wife could not sue or be sued in her own name. The wife could not make a will without her husband's agreement. The physical person of the wife was similarly subject to the husband's authority in ways that the Victorian legal system's treatment of the domestic violence question reveals with the specific clarity of the law that had not yet decided to take the harm seriously. The legal doctrine that the husband had the right to physically chastise his wife. The specific rule of thumb tradition that is now understood to be largely mythological in its specific form, but that reflected a genuine legal reality of the husband's authority over the wife's person, was not formally rejected by the English courts until 1891, when the Court of Appeal ruled in the case of Regina versus Jackson that the husband didn't have the right to confine his wife to enforce his conjugal rights. The 1891 Jackson case, the specific case of Edmund Jackson, who had physically abducted his wife Emily from the steps of a church where she was attending a service and confined her in his house to compel her to live with him, was the case that the Court of Appeal used to establish that the husband's common law right to confine his wife was not in fact a right that the law would enforce. The specific legal reasoning of the case, the court's rejection of the idea that the wife was the husband's property to be recovered by force, was the specific important legal development that came embarrassingly late in the Victorian period. In 1891, when the century was nearly over, the divorce was theoretically available for the Victorian wife, but practically accessible only to the specific Victorian wife, who had both the financial resources and the legal grounds that the Victorian divorce law required. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 had created the Civil Divorce Court and made divorce available without the specific act of Parliament that had previously been required, a reform that made divorce accessible to the wealthy rather than exclusively to the very wealthy. But the divorce law maintained the specific double standard that the Victorian sexual morality had embedded in the legal framework. The husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone, while the wife was required to prove adultery, plus an additional marital fault, cruelty, desertion, bigamy, to obtain the divorce. The specific double standard of the Victorian divorce law was the specific legislative expression of the Victorian sexual morality's different expectations for male and female behavior, and it was the specific target of the feminist criticism that identified the law as the institutional expression of the double standard. The wife who had suffered the husband's adultery alone had no grounds for divorce. The husband who had suffered the wife's adultery had full grounds. The specific inequality was written into the statute. The women who chose not to marry, the specific Victorian women whose choice of the single life was the choice of the legal independence that the married woman's coverture denied, were the women whose decision the Victorian culture classified as the failure of the domestic ideal, and who understood it as the specific rational preference for the legal personhood over the legal dissolution that the marriage would produce. The Victorian spinster, the woman who had not married, was the woman who occupied the specific social position of the incomplete feminine, the woman who had failed to achieve the domestic destiny that the Victorian culture prescribed for her. The specific social and financial vulnerability of the Victorian spinster, without the husband's income, without the social status of the wife, dependent on the family that might or might not provide the specific support that the unmarried woman required, was the vulnerability that the culture used as the specific argument for the marriage: marry or face this. The specific women who chose the unmarried life and built the professional and intellectual careers that the married woman's legal situation made difficult were the women who had found or been given the specific economic independence that made the choice possible. The new woman, the specific figure of the 1890s Victorian feminist cultural imagination, the woman who cycled and read and worked and declined to marry on the terms that the law and the culture provided, was the figure that the Victorian press and the Victorian cartoonist found most alarming and most interesting. The new woman was alarming because she was visible. She was the specific embodied challenge to the domestic ideal that the parlor had been built to contain, and she was conducting her challenge in public, on the bicycle, in the university lecture hall, in the professional office. She was interesting because she was right. The specific critique of the Victorian marriage that the new woman embodied, the critique of the legal disability, the financial dependence, the intellectual restriction, the specific coverture that made the married woman the legal dependent of the man she married, was the correct critique of the specific real injustice of the Victorian legal and social system. The new woman was not the aberration of the woman who had failed the domestic ideal. She was the specific early expression of the normal woman who had examined the specific terms of the domestic ideal and found them unacceptable. Chapter 13. The friendship, the specific, intense, underestimated, emotional lives of Victorian women. The friendship was not a substitute. The specific, intimate friendships of Victorian women. The relationships between women that the Victorian letters and the Victorian diaries document with an emotional intensity that the modern reader encounters with a specific surprise. The intensity of the feeling expressed for the female friend, the specific language of the love that the Victorian woman deployed in describing her relationship with her closest women friends, have been interpreted through a variety of historical lenses that each produce a different picture of what these relationships were and what they meant. The lens of the modern sexuality scholarship has produced the reading of these relationships as the evidence of the suppressed lesbian desire, the specific, prohibited feeling that the Victorian social framework forced into the available channel of the intense female friendship. This reading has genuine evidence. There were Victorian women who loved women in the specific, erotic sense, and the intense female friendship provided the specific social space in which this love could be expressed without the specific naming that would have activated the Victorian social and legal sanctions. But the intense female friendship was not only the suppressed desire looking for the available channel. It was also the specific, genuine, primary emotional relationship of the Victorian woman's life. The friendship that provided the intellectual companionship, the emotional support, the specific intimacy of the shared understanding that the Victorian marriage's structure did not always provide. The husband and wife of the Victorian ideal occupied different social spheres. The husband, the public sphere of the work and the politics. The wife, the domestic sphere of the household and the social obligation. And the specific different experiences of the two spheres produced the specific, genuine incomprehension between them that the letter and the diary document with the honesty of the private record. The friendship between women was the friendship of the shared sphere, the specific, intimate relationship of the women who occupied the same social world, who shared the same experiences, who understood the specific constraints and the specific satisfactions of the Victorian woman's life from the inside. The letter that the Victorian woman wrote to her closest female friend was the letter that contained the things she could say to the friend that she could not say to the husband, not because the marriage was bad or cold, but because the friend shared the specific understanding that the difference in the spheres produced. The specific letters of the Victorian women's friendships are among the most extraordinary documents in the Victorian epistolary record. The correspondence between Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby. The ladies of Llangollen, the two women who had run away together in 1778 and established the household at Plasnewid that they shared for 50 years, was the correspondence of the long, committed, intimate partnership that the Victorian period observed with a specific combination of the admiration for the romantic friendship and the deliberate refusal to name what the romantic friendship was. The ladies of Llangollen were celebrated. Their specific relationship was not examined with the scrutiny that the examination would have required. The Boston marriage, the specific American term for the long-term cohabitation of two women who shared a household and a life, was the specific institution that the late Victorian period produced as the social form of the intense female friendship taken to its practical conclusion. The women of the Boston marriage were the women who had decided that the domestic partnership of the female friendship was preferable to the domestic partnership of the Victorian marriage. Not always because of the specific erotic dimension that the modern reader tends to assume, but because the intellectual and emotional companionship of the female friendship was the relationship they found most sustaining. The specific intensity of the Victorian women's friendship was the intensity of the people who had been assigned to the same social space, and who found in that space the specific, genuine companionship of the shared experience. The Victorian women who created the sewing circles, and the reading groups, and the charitable committees, and the political organizations were not only creating institutions for the specific purposes those institutions served, they were creating the social spaces of the female companionship that the domestic ideology had concentrated in the female sphere, and that the women who occupied that sphere had developed into the specific, rich social world of the Victorian women's community. The reading group was the specific institution of the Victorian women's intellectual life, the gathering of women who read the same book and met to discuss it, providing the specific intellectual companionship of the shared engagement with the ideas that the book contained. The Victorian women's reading group was the specific, accessible form of the intellectual community that the university and the learned society denied to the majority of women, the form in which the intellectual ambition and the social framework of the domestic sphere could coexist. The book group as the parlor's specific contribution to the life of the mind. The specific books that the Victorian women's reading groups read, and the specific discussions that those readings produced, are documented in the diaries and the letters that the reading group participants wrote. And the picture they produce is the picture of women engaging seriously and rigorously with the intellectual content of what they were reading, arguing about the philosophical and moral questions that the novels and the essays raised, developing the specific analytical skills of the close reader who has taken the text seriously rather than consuming it passively. The friendship sustained the Victorian woman through the specific demands of the domestic life, in ways that the domestic ideology, which placed the husband at the center of the wife's emotional world and the domestic sphere at the center of her activity, was not always adequate to sustain alone. The friend who understood the specific experience of the Victorian woman's life was the friend whose understanding was the specific relief of the person whose experience had been genuinely seen and genuinely acknowledged, and the Victorian women who maintained these friendships across the decades and the distances. The letters written weekly, the visits made annually, the specific sustained investment in the relationship that the correspondence required, were the women who understood that the friendship was not the supplement to the domestic life, but one of its essential foundations. Chapter 14. The Travel. How Victorian Women Went Places. They were not supposed to go. The passport did not specify a gender restriction. This is the specific small fact that the Victorian woman traveler exploited with the specific practical pragmatism of the person who had identified that the theoretical restriction on her movement was less universal than the domestic ideology claimed. The Victorian social convention that prescribed the middle-class woman's existence to the domestic sphere was exactly that, a social convention, not a legal prohibition. And the woman who had the financial means, the physical determination, and the specific willingness to disregard the social disapproval could and did travel extensively and independently to places that the social convention had not anticipated a woman going. Isabella Bird was a specific Victorian woman traveler who most comprehensively demolished the assumption that the middle-class woman's health and constitution were unequal to the demands of serious travel. Bird suffered from a spinal condition that made her life in England the conventional domestic sedentary life of the invalid Victorian woman genuinely miserable. Abroad, on horseback in the Rocky Mountains, or trekking through Japan, or riding through Persia, the specific physical demands of the serious travel that the domestic convention would have found preposterous for a woman of her health produced in her a specific counterintuitive improvement. The invalid who could not manage the domestic drawing room could manage the 900 miles on horseback through Colorado in the winter of 1873. Bird's letters from her travels, published as the specific books that made her the most widely read Victorian travel writer, were the specific, detailed, vivid documents of the woman who was seeing things that the domestic convention had not prepared her audience to imagine a woman seeing, and reporting them with the specific, calm authority of the person who had been there and knew what she was talking about. The Rocky Mountains, the Hawaiian volcanoes, the Japanese interior, the Yangtze River, the Persian Plateau. Bird went to all of these places and wrote about them with the specific intelligence and the specific powers of observation that the travel book required. She was also elected the first female fellow of the Royal Geographical Society in 1892, an election that the specific subsequent backlash against the women's admission produced in the most direct form of the institutional recognition being granted and then partially rescinded. The RGS admitted women as fellows in 1892, then reversed the decision under pressure from the male fellows who objected to the women's inclusion, readmitting women only in 1913. Bird's fellowship was the specific symbolic acknowledgement that the institution then declined to maintain. Mary Kingsley was the other Victorian woman traveler whose specific achievement, the exploration of West Africa, the ascent of Mount Cameroon by a new route, the collection of the natural history specimens, and the ethnographic documentation that the scientific world valued, and that the woman who produced them was not expected to be capable of producing, made the domestic convention's predictions about what women could and could not do look specifically and publicly wrong. Kingsley had spent the first 30 years of her life almost entirely at home, caring for her invalid parents in the specific Victorian tradition of the unmarried daughter's domestic obligation. When both parents died within months of each other in 1892, Kingsley was 30 years old, had almost no formal education, had barely left England, and had the specific sudden freedom of the person whose obligation has ended and who has not yet decided what comes next. What came next was West Africa, the specific, dangerous, disease-ridden, logistically impossible destination that the woman who had never traveled independently had chosen for her first independent journey. Kingsley traveled through the Gabon and the Cameroon with the specific, practical, unsentimental approach of the woman who had decided to go and was going, negotiating with the traders and the missionaries, paddling the dugout canoes, collecting the fish specimens and the natural history observations, and the ethnographic documentation of the West African cultures that she was encountering, with the specific serious attention of the researcher who had come to learn. She was also funny. Kingsley's accounts of her travels, particularly travels in West Africa, published in 1897, were the specific literary documents of the woman who could describe nearly drowning in a crocodile-infested river, with the dry, precise comic timing of the person who had survived it, and could see the specific absurdity of the situation in retrospect. The specific humor of Kingsley's travel writing was the humor of the person who had been told that she could not do the thing she had done and who found the gap between the prediction and the reality genuinely amusing. The Victorian woman traveler's experience of the places she went was the experience of the observer, who arrived without the specific assumptions about what she was supposed to find, without the colonial apparatus of the official expedition, without the institutional authority that made the male explorer the representative of the empire rather than the curious individual. Kingsley's specific argument for the respect of the West African cultures she visited. Her insistence that the ethnographic observation required the specific, genuine engagement with the culture on its own terms, rather than the dismissal of it as the inferior stage of the civilizational progress, was the argument of the woman who had arrived without the specific institutional investment in the inferior that the official expedition carried, and who had therefore been able to see what she actually found rather than what she had been sent to confirm. The domestic ideology had said, women's sphere is the home. The Victorian women travelers had said, the home is where I currently happen to be, and I am leaving it. The specific practical challenge to the domestic ideologies, geographic prescriptions, was the challenge of the women who went to West Africa, to the Rocky Mountains, to Japan, to the Yangtze, to Mount Cameroon, and came back with the specific evidence of what women could do when they were doing it, rather than being told what they could not do. Chapter 15. The legacy, what the Victorian woman left behind. The century ended, and the women were still there. This is the specific fact that the Victorian mythology, the mythology of the contained, the domestic, the decorative, the passively sitting, consistently fails to account for. The Victorian period ended in 1901 with the death of the Queen, whose name the period carried, And the women who had spent that century managing and writing and campaigning and calculating and teaching and traveling and fighting were still there in the specific form of the institutions they had built and the laws they had changed and the precedents they had set and the daughters they had raised to expect more than their mothers had been permitted. The women's colleges were there. Girton and Newnham stood at Cambridge, containing the women who were sitting the same examinations as the men and receiving the certificates rather than the degrees, awaiting the specific institutional acknowledgement that would come in 1948. Late, embarrassingly late, but coming. The London School of Medicine for Women was there, producing the women doctors whose existence the Victorian medical establishment had spent decades insisting was impossible. The board schools were there, staffed in large part by the women teachers whose professional competence the Elementary Education Act had made essential to the system's functioning. The Married Women's Property Acts were there. The specific hard-won legislation of 1870 and 1882 that had given the married woman the legal personhood that the coverture doctrine had denied her for centuries. Not perfect, not complete, but there, the specific legislative evidence that the campaign had worked, that the organized, sustained, systematic pressure that the Victorian women's movement had applied to the parliamentary process had produced the specific result that the process was supposed to produce when it worked as it was supposed to. The suffrage campaign was there. Not yet successful, the vote still denied, but organized and funded and staffed and strategically sophisticated in the specific way of the movement that has been building for decades and understands exactly what it needs and how to pursue it. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, that Millicent Garrett Fawcett would lead into the new century, was the specific institutional inheritance of the Victorian suffrage campaigners. The accumulated organizational capacity, the political intelligence, the specific knowledge of how to build and maintain and direct the mass political movement that the subsequent campaign would require. The literary tradition was there. The Victorian novel, the specific, extraordinary literary form of the period, had been built in significant part by the women who wrote it, and the works they had produced were the specific cultural inheritance that the century left to the next. George Eliot's Middlemarch, the Bronte sisters' Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, the sensation novels of Mary Elizabeth Braddon, the hundreds of other novels by women whose names the canon subsequently forgot, but whose work had shaped what the Victorian novel was and what it could do. The scientific record was there. The stellar catalogs and the botanical collections and the fossil discoveries and the mathematical calculations that the women who had done the work had contributed to the Victorian scientific tradition, imperfectly credited, selectively acknowledged, but present in the specific permanent form of the scientific knowledge that the work had produced. The knowledge does not disappear when the credit is withheld from the person who produced it. It remains doing the specific work that knowledge does, building the foundation on which the subsequent work stands, whether or not the foundation's builder is remembered by the people standing on it. The Victorian woman's legacy was not the legacy of the person who had sat in the parlor and waited. It was the legacy of the person who had worked in every available space, through every available channel, against every specific resistance that the century's institutions had deployed to build the specific world that the next century would inhabit. She handed it forward, and the next century took it and ran. Conclusion: what she really did. The full picture of the Victorian woman's life. She was not sitting in the parlor, or rather she was sitting in the parlor occasionally, briefly, in the specific moments between the management and the labor, and the social obligation, and the creative work, and the political organizing, and the scientific contribution, and the travel and the friendship, and the reading and the fighting for the rights that the law and the culture were systematically denying her. The parlor was real. The sitting was occasional. The mythology that made the sitting the whole picture is the mythology that the Victorian domestic ideology produced, and that the subsequent history has been slow to correct. The correction matters, not because the Victorian woman's life was secretly better than the mythology suggests. It was not, in many of its specific material, legal, and social dimensions, a good life, and the specific injustices of the coverture and the educational restriction and the professional exclusion and the medical mismanagement and the piece rate exploitation were real injustices that damage real women in real specific ways. The correction matters because the incomplete picture, the woman as passive, decorative, idle, contained, is the picture that the Victorian culture produced to justify the containment, and repeating it is repeating the justification. The Victorian domestic ideology argued that women were suited to the domestic sphere because women were naturally domestic, gentle, emotional, intuitive, unsuited to the rigors of the professional and the intellectual life. The evidence of what Victorian women actually did, the management of the complex household, the scientific contribution, the literary production, the political organizing, the physical achievement of the travel, the specific intellectual seriousness of the reading group, and the correspondence and the education reform, is the systematic refutation of the ideology's central claim. Mary Somerville naming the scientists, Philippa Fawcett placing above the senior wrangler, George Eliot writing Middlemarch, the match girls of Bryant and May walking out and winning, Isabella Bird on horseback in the Rocky Mountains in the winter, the women of the suffrage campaign building the movement that would eventually change the law, the women computers cataloging the stars, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson obtaining the medical qualification through the one door that had not yet thought to close itself, the village school teacher managing 40 children in the board school, the working class woman managing the household on the impossible income with the specific daily intelligence of the person for whom no margin for error existed. These are not the exceptions that the domestic ideology's mythology would make them. They are the evidence of the normal, the specific, documented record of what Victorian women did when they were not being told what they couldn't do, and frequently when they were being told what they could not do and were doing it anyway. The Victorian woman's life was the life of the person operating under genuine, serious, institutionally enforced constraints, legal, social, economic, physical, that the modern world rightly looks at and calls unjust. But it was also the life of the person who found the specific space within those constraints, and beyond them to think, to create, to organize, to achieve, and to build the specific foundations on which the subsequent centuries' changes were constructed. The Married Women's Property Act was built by the women who campaigned for it for decades. The women's colleges of Oxford and Cambridge were built by the women who raised the funds and designed the curriculum and ran the institutions. The suffrage campaign was built by the women who understood that the vote was the specific instrument whose absence made every other injustice sustainable. The literary tradition of the Victorian novel was built in significant part by the women who wrote it at the kitchen table in the margins of the domestic day. The scientific knowledge of the Victorian period was built in part by the women whose calculations and whose collections and whose observations the publications did not always acknowledge. The Victorian woman who sat in the parlor sat there in the specific brief moment between the work that had preceded the sitting and the work that would follow it. The chair was temporary. The work was continuous. The history that remembers only the chair has made a specific consequential error. The error of mistaking the furniture for the person, the domestic space for the domestic life, the brief stillness for the whole activity. The parlor is still there. The velvet is still on the chairs. The anti-macassars are still on the chairbacks, protecting the upholstery from the macassar hair oil that the Victorian man applied to his hair. And the woman who sat there briefly, between the morning's management and the evening's obligation, is not the woman of the mythology. She is the woman of the history, specific, particular, various, constrained, and resourceful, and determined, and creative, and occasionally furious, and frequently brilliant. She was not sitting in the parlor. She was building the world she lived in. One specific, undercredited, historically undervalued act at a time. That is what Victorian women really did all day.